And Cyril Ramaphosa announced a 21-day national lockdown starting at midnight this Thursday. And to talk to us more about some of the security measures here is senior researcher in the Crime and Justice Program at the Institute for Security Studies, Dr. Johan Burger. Dr. Burger, good morning. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you and good morning.
Dr. Burger, let's just take a look at some of the legalities around this lockdown, because there is obviously going to be a question about what can and can't citizens do at this time. So let's just focus on that for a moment.
Well, I think the essence of the announcement is to limit contact between persons across the country. So that means that you have to implement measures to either completely prevent or then drastically reduce opportunities for people to mix. And I think this is the essence of the lockdown, with the exclusion, of course, of certain categories of people, such as the police, health workers, and other essential personnel. So ordinary individuals will be limited in terms of movement to the extent that they can purchase basic necessities such as food and health products. But other than that, I think we will basically be locked down at our homes and not be able to move freely around. So it's a very drastic intervention in the lives of ordinary citizens.
Very drastic, as you say, Dr. Burger, and it might be legitimate, it might be lawful, but of course there are concerns about how governments will actually mitigate the impact of these stringent measures. So what exactly will law enforcement be allowed to do and not do?
I think that is the big question. Even under normal circumstances, the police find it difficult to properly execute their law enforcement responsibilities, given the situation in South Africa, high levels of crime, high levels of lawlessness across the country, and one can only imagine the challenges the police will be faced with in this situation, with the additional measures announced by the President that are contained in the various regulations that were already published and that will probably now be published, new regulations in terms of the President's announcement yesterday evening. So the police will be faced with huge challenges. I must say it's quite obvious that they have done a lot of work in preparation for this state of national disaster and their obligations. We also have to keep in mind that they themselves run the risk of being infected, and so the police have announced a number of measures to ensure that they can deal with infections in their own ranks, that they take every precaution that is possible to them, also ensuring that their facilities are properly cleaned to ensure that where the public do have to visit their offices, that they are protected against the spread of the virus. So I think what we'll probably see, and the regulations, the new regulations will have to be clear about this, is what do the police do when they encounter members of the public moving in contradiction of the new regulations? Will they have the powers to be arrested? We don't know the detail of these powers yet, but I expect that there will be clear guidelines for the police in terms of what they should do when they encounter members of the public. For example, we have no idea yet, as is the case in some other countries, where people who have to make emergency visits to medical facilities, for example, to buy food, where they have to have some documentary proof that they have received permission to make that journey. So these are all details that still needs to be clarified, and I think we are all waiting for these guidelines so that we also know what we are able to do and will be prevented from doing.
And it's a very important line of clarity that we seek here, Dr. Burger, especially given vulnerable communities in South Africa. We know our socioeconomic situation. We know that there are people who may have to venture out onto the streets just to get something to eat. And, you know, we talk about the guidelines that will be put in place. There will be people who may not even have access to data in order to access some of these facilities that will be needed to keep abreast of developments. So where does one then draw the line between the actual rights that will come into play right now that the government has put in place and over policing and criminalization of acts where people are trying to literally keep body and soul together?
Yeah, that's an interesting discussion. I think the Act, the National Disaster Management Act, does provide for government in a state of emergency, with a national state of disaster, to announce and to introduce a certain interventions or certain steps that may infringe on our basic rights. But of course, those rights can still be maintained through our courts. Parliament will have a supervisory role to ensure that these rights are not infringed unnecessarily. So I think it's going to be a balancing act in terms of maintaining our basic rights in terms of the Bill of Rights, as well as allowing government to maintain the necessary precautions that this state of disaster requires for us in order to deal with this threat, to prevent the spread of the virus. So it's a difficult situation, but you know, there's so many aspects of this lockdown that still needs to be clarified, and you rightly referred to people's need to access food and other necessities, and hopefully, and I'm certain the police will consider these measures and their reaction to how they implement these measures is to be circumspect to the extent that although we need the police to enforce these regulations, they need to do so in a way that is humane, that takes into the consideration basic needs of certain people in certain conditions. So I think it's going to be a huge challenge to the police, and I'm thinking, you know, we can expect that there will be instances where they don't get it right, and we need to also sympathize with them. They are facing an even bigger challenge than the rest of us. The rest of us can stay at home and just keep ourselves busy and feel sorry for ourselves, but the police are the ones, along with the military and other emergency staff, they will be the ones that will have to go out on the streets and to try and perform in a way that will allow the enforcement of these regulations to try and limit movement, and by so doing try to reduce or limit at least the spread of the virus.
And then, Dr. Burger, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights has called on states to tread very carefully here. We also have heard from several human rights groups in Europe especially calling on governments to be proportionate and for these measures to be time limited. So those are very important provisions, because if these are not limited, then it does pose a threat to people's civil liberties, doesn't it?
No, it does, you know, but again, I think we need to consider the possible repercussions of us being so strict on our rights that we, in the end, create a condition where the virus spreads, and then none of us will have any rights, apart from the right to die, the right to become seriously ill. And those are the repercussions that we have to consider. So we need to have a balanced view on maintaining our rights to the extreme that you will have in a normal situation compared to an abnormal situation such as we currently have. The alternative is if we make too much noise about our rights, that we force government to move from a state of disaster to a national state of emergency, which allows the president a drastic to drastically interfere with our basic rights, with the exclusion only of a limited number of rights. So those the Emergency Act, State of Emergency Act, allows the president a much more serious intervention in terms of our rights and how we deal with a situation such as that. Now, hopefully this would be the last option, the most extreme option, but it is possible. The Constitution allows the president to do so. He's not done so thus far, and we need to respect him for using the more limited measures allowed by the State of Disaster Act.
And just finally, Dr. Burger, anything more specifically that you would like to highlight, especially in terms of what ideally would be the relationship between the public, police, and of course the army at this point?
I think it's important that we respect the responsibilities of the police, the military in support of the police, and other emergency services personnel. They have an extremely important and very, very challenging role to play during this time. And we need to respect the fact that they are doing so in all our interest. It is in our interest that the spread of this virus be limited, be reduced as far as possible. So they are the ones that will help us do so. From our side, I think apart from respecting their role and their responsibilities, we need to understand that we all have a responsibility. We all need to understand that the police and the military and others cannot do this all by themselves. We need to make the task easier by conducting ourselves in a way that will conform with the announcement by the president and that will keep us safe. That is important, us, our families, and our loved ones. So we all have a role to play. It's not just the military and the police. We can't just look at them as, fulfilling a role of locking us down. That's not the thing. It's a question of locking ourselves down. And they will have to deal with those that do not show the self-discipline to do so.
Well, thank you so much. Senior researcher in the Crime and Justice Program at the Institute for Security Studies, Dr. Johan Burger, from that institute, giving us a little more understanding of the meaning of the lockdown and how it's likely to affect us. It's over to Leanne now for your latest.